Hit it.
Section 3, Scope of Work Rule. Learning Objectives. At the conclusion of this section, students should attain the following. State the USPAP definition of scope of work. List the necessary elements to determine an appropriate scope of work. Explain the need and how to properly collect data for problem identification. Identify when the scope of work is acceptable. Explain why anticipated appraisal methodologies may be excluded. Scope of work. The scope of work of any project is generally identified as the section of an agreement where the work to be performed is defined or explained. Usually, a scope of work for a project or other similar assignment contains milestones, deliverables, and reports. The scope of work is defined in USPAP. The scope of work as defined in USPAP is the type and extent of research and analysis applied in an appraisal or appraisal review assignment. The scope of work is a roadmap for the appraisers, the intended users, regarding what work will be necessary to perform the assignment. It will identify the type of data to be collected to correctly determine the proper conclusion. It will also outline the amount of data needed and the type of research necessary for the assignment. The scope of work may also establish the boundaries or extent to which the appraiser must go to collect the data. It's possible the assignment may require the appraisal to look outside the neighborhood, county, or state in search of representative data. Property Tax Code requirements for scope of work. Tax Code Section 6.05I is the requirement that all appraisal districts must develop a scope of work as required by USPAP. Biennially. Yeah, that's what I'm trying to say. Hang on. My mouth don't want to work. The biennially, there it is, reappraisal plan is the appraisal district's scope of work for a mass appraisal assignment. It states, to ensure adherence with generally accepted appraisal practices, the board of directors of an appraisal district shall develop biennially a written plan for the periodic reappraisal of all property within the boundaries of the district according to the requirements of Section 25.18 and shall hold a public hearing to consider the proposed plan, not later than the 10th day before the date of the hearing. The secretary of the board shall deliver to the presiding officer of the governing body of each taxing unit participating in the district a written notice of the date, time, and place for the hearing, not later than September 15th of each even-numbered year. The board shall complete its hearings, make amendments, and by resolution finally approve the plan. Copies of the approved plan shall be distributed to the presiding officer of the governing body of each taxing unit participating in the district and to the comptroller within 60 days of the appraisal date. Texas Code Section 25.18A states that each appraisal office shall implement the plan for periodic reappraisal of property approved by the Board of Directors under 6.05I. Instructor's note: while the section of the tax code lays out what should go into a periodic reappraisal plan, it is not verbatim out of USPAP. Much of the content is based on the concepts covered in USPAP. It is not word for word in either Standard 5 or Scope of Work Rule. Students should be encouraged to review this part of tax code. What?
I'm looking at where you are.
Oh, I'm starting on page 30. Development of the scope of work. To begin the process of determining the correct scope of work for any appraisal assignment, the appraiser must identify the problem to be solved, determine the scope of work necessary to develop credible assignment results, and disclose the scope of work in the report. To properly determine the appropriate scope of work, a scope of work will include, but is not limited to, the extent to which the property is identified, the extent to which the tangible property is inspected, the type and extent of data researched, and the type and extent of analysis applied to arrive at opinions or conclusions. Appraisers have broad flexibility and significant responsibility in determining the appropriate scope of work for an assignment. Credible assignment results require support by relevant evidence and logic. The credibility of assignment results is always measured in the context of the intended use. Problem identification. For more information, see AO 28. Super. Appraisers must gather and analyze information about the assignment to properly identify the appraisal or appraisal review problem to be solved. Identification of the problem to be solved requires the appraiser to identify the following: client and any other intended users, intended use of the appraiser's opinion or conclusions, type and definition of value, effective date of the appraiser's opinion and or conclusions, subject of the assignment and its relevant characteristics, and any assignment conditions. This information provides the appraiser with the basis of determining the type and extent of research that will be needed to develop the appraisal. Appraisers must accurately research and collect data pertaining to the problem attempting to be solved. The type of data they collect can prove to be challenging when data availability is an issue. Scope of work acceptability. How would an appraiser know if the scope of work, if developed, is How would an appraiser know if the scope of work developed is acceptable? USPAP provides a test of acceptability. The scope of work is acceptable when it meets or exceeds the expectations of parties who are regularly intended users of similar assignments and what an appraiser's peers' actions would be in performing the same or similar assignment. Determining the scope of work is an ongoing process. Information or conditions discovered during the course of an assignment might cause the appraiser to reconsider the scope of work. An appraiser must be prepared to support a scope of work decision. Any decision to exclude an investigation method or technique must be supported. If an appraisal method would seem relevant to the client but is excluded by the appraiser must have sound reasoning behind the decision. Credible assignment results are the intended goal of any appraisal-related assignment. As a result, the appraiser must not allow assignment conditions to limit the scope of work, allow the intended use of the assignment to result in bias, or allow the client's objectives to result in bias. Disclosure of the scope of work. The report must have sufficient information to allow intended users to understand the scope of work. Proper disclosure is required because intended users rely on the assignment's results and conclusions. Those are review questions.